Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the FCCJ. My name is Isabel Reynolds. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News, and I'm also the first vice president at the FCCJ. I apologize. I'm taking over at the very last minute for this event, so I have not prepared to take over this role very well. But I think Dennis Blair is someone who's very familiar to everybody in the room. Obviously, the former commander of the US Pacific Command, former US Director of National Intelligence. He has also introduced a last-minute change to the presentation. He'll be focusing more on the cyber defense area as opposed to China, which was the first area that we had in mind. But still a very interesting topic for all of us, I'm sure. And he said he's open to questions about China, North Korea, and all the other defense issues that are top of our minds at the moment. So I'll leave it at that and hand over for the presentation, which I think will take about 20 minutes? Or?
Right, about 15, 20 minutes.
Right, and then we'll open it up for questions after that. Okay, right. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks, Isabel, and sorry to throw you into this at the last minute, but you'll do fine. And as Isabel said, what I'd like to talk about is Japan improving its cyber defenses, because I think this is the weakest area in the security alliance right now between the United States and Japan, and we need to bring it up to the level of the other more traditional areas of military cooperation in order to keep things quiet and peaceful in this part of the world. So let me talk a little bit about that, because there's been a tremendous amount of worrisome activity around the world with Ukraine fighting going on after the Russian invasion, with China reacting so strongly to a visit to Taiwan by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, and by some of the rhetoric that has come out of the 20th Party Congress as Xi Jinping was awarded a third term as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China. Nuclear sabers rattling with Putin, sabers rattling by Xi Jinping. And so there's a lot to concern us these days. So, as I said, the U.S.-Japan security relationship has just gotten stronger in the 50 years that I've been part of it, from the days in the mid-1980s when I commanded a destroyer stationed in Yokosuka, and I would sail out. Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force ships would sail out a little bit later, and we had to stay apart until we were beyond helicopter range of NHK and many of your news organizations. Once we were beyond about 80 miles or so, then we could get together and operate together. That's what it was like 50 years ago. Now, the military cooperation for deterrence by the American Armed Forces and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces has become much stronger, tighter, more effective. And so it gives our enemies pause, makes them think they should try something else, not military aggression, and that's what the job is. But we do have a weakness in our cyber defense capabilities, which could undermine all of the tremendous strength that has come in more traditional military spheres. So the event that is driving military cybersecurity the most strongly now is Ukraine. Remember, it was only about 5 or 6 years ago that Russian hackers actually took a Ukrainian electrical power plant offline for about 6 hours, knocked it back. And then, of course, in 2014, Russia invaded Crimea and the eastern provinces of Ukraine and has been there ever since. Since that time, about 8 years ago, the Ukrainians themselves have been working hard on their cyber defense capabilities, and many of their friends, including the United States, have been helping them to make those defenses stronger. And I think the surprise to many experts now is how Ukrainian cyber defenders have handled the attacks, which have been quite strong, well-skilled, well-resourced attacks to try to take down Ukrainian critical infrastructure, telecommunications, power, water, as well as to penetrate the defense networks that they rely on for national security. But you can tell they have not succeeded. President Zelensky still talks to his country every night. He talks to many of us around the world quite often. The very capable Ukrainian defenders can communicate with each other. They are, in fact, using influence operations against the mothers of Russian soldiers who have been killed in Ukraine. So I think it's quite remarkable how effective Ukrainian defenses can be and how this little country, Ukraine, has been so effective against what was considered to be one of the most powerful cyber attack capabilities in the world. So Ukrainian defenders themselves have done the most, but they've not been alone. Alongside them have been American government cyber defenders from the U.S. Cyber Command. Counterparts from the United Kingdom have been there, from the Netherlands, from Estonia, and many other countries. But there's no one there from Japan. There's no Japanese cyber defender who is in Kyiv working with the Ukrainians. Japan has been wonderfully effective in joining the international coalition to punish Russia. Japanese sanctions have been as strict as any other country. Its diplomatic work, condemning Russia in the United Nations, working around the world, all of that exemplary. But Japanese cyber defenders are not helping the Ukraine and also learning in the defense of Ukraine what active cyber defense in conditions of war is actually like. And I think it should be there. Because as you flip the world around, you see the threats and the crises that Japan and its ally, the United States, face in this part of the world also have a very large, important cyber component, whether it be Senkakus, in which Japan has the lead, the United States is in support, whether it be Taiwan, in which Taiwan, of course, is in the lead, the United States is committed to support, depending on how a war happens, but it's in Japan's neighborhood, and Japan will be affected. Japan territory is only 50 kilometers away from Taiwan, after all. Or in the South China Sea, where completely false Chinese claims of sovereignty are a challenge to all seafaring nations, the United States, Japan, Australia, European countries. So there are potential problems in this side of the world. And I think the lesson that we should draw from what's going on in Ukraine is that cyber defense is not impossible. The cyber attackers are not all-powerful. They can be stopped. A country can defend its networks. A country can keep its population from being influenced by malicious social media. The United States National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis, has said publicly, I always thought that cyber war, you only played two fullbacks. Everybody was up as an attacker, and you were just scoring all sorts of goals. I'm realizing now in Ukraine that you can have a good, strong defense in addition to having attackers playing goals. So the world has shifted, and I think that gives us hope. In this part of the world, Taiwan is not an aggressor. The United States is not an aggressor. Japan is not an aggressor. We will be fundamentally in a defensive situation, and we should not think that that is hopeless in the cyber world any more than it's hopeless in the maritime, the air, the space, the other worlds in which we can make any military adventure extremely high risk for China, not worth attempting. But to be strong in cyber, Japan has a lot of work to do. It will take money, it will take people, it will take constitutional interpretations and actual changes of telecommunications laws, and it will take coordination with the United States and other partners who, I should say, would like to help Japan, would like to work with Japan to a much greater extent than we do right now. So let me go back to that U.S. cyber defense capability components. Let me tell you quickly about how the United States has organized it. There you go. This is a pretty simple diagram, but shown in red are organizations, two of them fairly recently developed by the United States, that Japan simply does not have right now and needs. As a result of the recommendations of the Solarium Commission, a congressionally mandated study of American cybersecurity, a recommendation was made that the United States put in the White House a national cyber director with a small staff, and we have done that. The director is Chris Inglis, experienced in the private sector, in the intelligence sector, in the National Security Agency, in the U.S. Air Force, widely respected. And he has overall responsibility for policy, organization, and for effective response. For a long time, the United States has had the National Security Agency, and the National Security Agency has now really become the most skilled and powerful cyber intelligence organization in the world. A cyber command, an actual military command, stands up alongside of it. The National Security Agency is responsible mostly for penetrating enemy networks, for having the access, for being able to understand what's going on in our enemy networks and gathering intelligence about it. And then the Cyber Command has the teams that actually use that intelligence and go out and conduct active defense or even attack the attackers and put them out of business before they can get into our networks. And then in the lower right is another relatively new organization within the United States underneath our Department of Homeland Security, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, JCDC. And the diagram there came out a little bit wrong. Those two circles of government network operators and private sector network operators actually should overlap the JCDC. The JCDC has a skeleton staff from Department of Homeland Security, CISA. It has a big ops center. In that ops center are represented those who operate our government networks, Health and Homeland Services, the Tax Service, Office of Personnel Management, and at the same time, the major telecom operators and some of the major industries have representatives in that same ops center who are tied back to their own operating centers, so that JCDC is a team with public, private, and some authorities and ways to operate. They are tied directly to the American forward units in Ukraine, so that when information on a new type of Russian attack is discovered in Ukraine, it's immediately sent back on a Slack channel to JCDC. It's immediately put out. Again, we don't wait to put out a nice brochure with a glossy cover and nice pictures. It goes out like that over the Slack channel, along with the patch that needs to be made or the other measures that need to be taken, and everybody on the circuit can quickly make the change as soon as we discover it. So that sort of real-time operational public-private government organization is essential to dealing with cyber threats in this day and age, and Japan does not have one. Let's go quickly into what Japan has and doesn't have. So this next slide is talking about the government strengths and weaknesses. NISC, been around a long time, a lot of capable people, but so far it has not been given the charter and the resources to set up a JCDC-like operational skill, operational center, which can immediately work back and forth across public sectors. This was pretty visible during the Log4j hack. And it took a while for the word to get around in Japan as to what the effect was of this Java defect and what you needed to do to fix it. It got around the United States and to the other countries tightly aligned with the United States in cyber, the Five Eyes in particular, as to what was going on in Log4j and how to fix it quickly. So right now, if you look at the NIST website, there is a nice entry on Log4j, but this is months after it. We need to take quick action. It does have international connections, but generally it's in sending an email rather than putting a quick entry on a Slack channel. Got to work out the relationship between NISC and JDA, the organization that's putting in all of the Japanese digital networks within government. Need to, how are you going to put in the cybersecurity hardware and software parts of that? Who's going to be in charge in order when an event happens? And that hasn't quite been worked out yet. NPA has very good, strong capabilities to operate against cyber crime, has good international connections through Interpol. It has to be worked in. Everybody in Japan needs to know what the rules are in terms of what you can do. You have to protect your own citizens' privacy and rights, but you need to be able to be very dynamic and aggressive when going after the networks of potential enemies and competitors in places like North Korea, China, Russia, Iran. I saw a recent announcement that the Ministry of Defense has decided to increase its cyber organization. I think it's in the Ground Self-Defense Force organization right now, from its current 800 to 5,000. That's getting up to a critical mass. GCHQ in the UK, which is a very fine cyber organization, has about 6,000. So that personnel increase is getting there, but it's not just the people. You need to put in the supercomputers, the data centers, the R&D, the connections to private industry, the connections to universities, so that you're really on top of the latest trends in gathering cybersecurity. So let's turn to the private sector. When I first started talking about cybersecurity in Japan about 5 or 10 years ago, I think there was a great sense of denial. It just was not up on the radar of many companies or citizens. Now it is. That's a good thing. Japan has some good certs, especially competent seem to be the one in financial services, well-funded, keeps things fairly tight. Also in IT, there's some excellent individual training efforts. Tomorrow, I'll be going out to see the METI JPA ISC Center of Excellence, a year or two course for the people who actually write the software to protect power plants, industrial plants, red teams that attack them. It's a very good course, and there are others like that in Japan, and those need to be kept up to get the human capital. But as we know just from reading the news, even big, well-established companies like Mitsubishi and NEC have had serious data breaches. Right now, hospitals in Osaka are out of business because of ransomware attacks. And those are the big organizations. You get down to small and medium-sized enterprises. There was a report that came out a couple of weeks ago that showed worldwide, and that includes both the United States and Japan, those attacks are just skyrocketing. And these small organizations don't have a single person dedicated to cybersecurity. They're relying on others, and we've got to figure out a way to give them support and make them tougher than they are. The United States has an advantage in that we have a large number of cyber defenders who learn their trade in the National Security Agency, in the FBI, in the armed forces. They finished their 20 years of service, and they went out and established private cybersecurity companies. Mandiant, CrowdStrike, Palo Alto. You go around those cybersecurity companies and everybody has a short haircut, their shoes are shined, they don't have beards. Now you have a lot of people whose shoes aren't shined and who have ponytails and tattoos, but you also have these other people, and they get along pretty well. But the United States is fortunate in having this supply of people who are trained within government cybersecurity go out, found companies of their own. So not only are they skilled, but they also know the people back in government, so it crosses that private-public boundary fairly smoothly. And Japan does not have that yet. If you have 6,000 uniformed soldiers who are working cybersecurity, that'll be a good start. When they get out, they can start companies. But Japan has to increase its human need. And the coordinated threat response, as I say, needs to be speeded up. Much of it automated as possible. Certainly the rest of it put on a Slack channel. How would I evaluate Japan overall? This is a figure from the Solarium report, the big US report. And where that red arrow leading to Japan now is about where I would say Japan sits right at the moment in terms of its cyber defense capability. And where I have the Japan goal in black is where I think Japan ought to be. I don't think Japan wants to be out there as one of the primary cyber attackers around the world the way China and Russia are. But it has to have the active defense capability in order to defend itself. And I think that's a worthy goal to get up to at least that far on the deterrence and defense scale. Okay, so I've talked about them, but let me go back over the 5 individual steps that I think Japan needs to take in the next slide. First, Japan needs to establish a cyber intelligence agency. By the way, as you see up there, the NSA, National Security Agency provides 3/4 of American intelligence reports through the whole system. Central Intelligence Agency, National Geospatial Agency, many other, there's 17 national security or national intelligence organizations in the United States churning out intelligence reports, and 3/4 of them come from NSA. How many reports come from Japan based on cyber intelligence capability? 0. So you're starting at 25%, even if you're really, really good in human intelligence or in geospatial intelligence, and you're not that good yet, certainly in human intelligence. So this would help Japan across the board in terms of its intelligence and knowledge of what the bad guys are doing. The Organization for Government Cyber Defense needs to be clarified between NISC and JDA. Should not be competitive, has to be cooperative. I spent quite a bit of time on this Joint Cyber Defense Collaboration Center equivalent. I think Japan has the pieces to put that together. It just needs to be established, practiced. The JCDC in the United States gets plenty of practice every day by what our enemies are doing, but when you have some slack time, you need to throw in a red team, a problem you make up yourself, learn better, be able to take action before the crisis actually hits, take advantage of what's going on in Ukraine. I've mentioned a couple of times that constitutional interpretations and telecoms law needs to be established. Yes, protect the privacy and the rights of Japanese citizens, but give your active cyber defenders the authority to go into other people's networks. I think one of the prime examples we've had recently, if you were following the Ukraine early days back in February, Russian troops were massing on the Russian border to the east, Belarus in the north, and the United States president announced that Russia intended to invade. How did he know that? Putin didn't tell him. It was cyber intelligence. And they decided that they would make that announcement based on the penetration they had of Russian networks. They knew they were taking a chance. The Russians immediately, of course, put a huge counterintelligence operation into effect. How the hell did they know that? Whose computer was bad? Who was talking? So that went on. So you've got to get that ability, and then, as I said, a cyber director to pull it all together. So let me. I know we're running a little bit late. The last two slides we can sort of put on the screen as we're talking, but I think you have the idea of the steps that China is taking, that Japan needs to take, and if Japan can develop this capability, then it would be welcome in the Five Eyes organization, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, which exchange a lot of cyber information. Right now, Japan would not be so welcome because it's got nothing to contribute. It would just enter the organization as a taker, not a giver. But it needs to do these things, and then it would be welcome to be a proud member of that organization. So as I said, that one, and then the final two slides just show some particular organizations. My colleague, Professor Tezuka Satoru, has been working hard within the academic and government area to try to say what would these organizations actually look like, and you have a copy in the slides of where his thinking lies. That may be the exactly right answer. There may be something a little bit different, but you need to get serious about this. People, organization, authorities. So let me stop there, Isabel, and we can
Thank you
turn to
very much.
questions.
Yes, so if we could move straight on to questions. I have one myself, which is possibly a little bit vague, but you mentioned that 10 years ago Japan was in denial about cyber defense. Now things are moving forward a bit. But what do you think is the main barrier to moving on to doing these kind of things that you are proposing?
I mean, being frank, I think Japan has not embraced the internet as well as I would have expected. I arrived last night at Haneda Airport, and I was given my SOS app. It is the most unfriendly, buggiest piece of software that has ever been inflicted on all of the people who would like to come see your wonderful country. Before I left, I tried to put all of my data in it. I gave up in disgust. And then I got to the airport, and there were legions of young, bright Japanese 20-somethings who should be doing other stuff. And I just gave them my phone and said, you know, here's my passport, here's my phone, can you make it happen? I mean, it was just awful, awful network. So I think part of it is that Japan has not really embraced the internet and all of the things it can do in order to be effective. And then also, I think what really gets people's attention in cyber defense is when an incident happens, and it's sad. You lose money. In the case of hospitals, you hurt patients. But usually after that, people say, wow. The United States, despite what we've done, we had this Colonial Pipeline incident in which you couldn't fill your car up on the entire East Coast, and people said, we got to take it seriously. So I think it's a combination. I think Japan starts from a further point back because the internet has not taken hold the way it did in, say, Korea, China, or the United States. But also, I don't think Japan has had the serious enough cyber attacks that really make people think that this stuff is serious. And I think those are coming now.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to move to questions from the floor. Right. Could you please give your name and affiliation before your question?
Thank you, Isabella. Admiral, my name is Sho Kawakita with Kyoto News. I'm a senior staff writer of Kyoto. I would like to ask you about China because your former title of your presentation was Security
Right.
Concern under Xi Jinping's Dictatorship. As you know, Anthony Blinken has recently said repeatedly that China wants to take Taiwan on a much faster timeline than previously considered. Also, Navy Admiral Michael Gilday said he didn't rule out a window of this year or window of next year. However, they didn't show any clear evidence or grounds for them to say so. My question is, how do you read these statements? I mean, do you believe that they are talking based on a newly learned intelligence or new sort of updated information, or they are just sort of early warning attempts or information strategy to counter Beijing's propaganda generated from their 20th Congress held in Beijing last month? Thank you.
Right. I'm more in the second category that you talked about. I don't think there's a serious risk of China making an attempt to take Taiwan by force. The risk is just too high from the Chinese point of view. If you like taking Kyiv, you'll love taking Taipei. I mean, here was Russia. Ground forces only had to go about 40 kilometers to take over the capital of a country, and they couldn't do it. China has to go across 100 miles of often stormy seas, conduct an airborne and amphibious assault on the scale of Normandy, first time, right, after China hasn't had large-scale military operations since 1979, and those weren't very pretty. Vietnamese whipped them. So there's a lot of this kind of talk from China. You know, we have a lot of shiny toys. The Russians had a lot of shiny toys too, and didn't do them any good. It's not the shiny toys. It's the organization, the ability for initiative at the lower levels, the ability to overcome the initial setbacks. And it is just very hard to go across that amount of water into defenses which have been preparing for 70 years now. I've been to Taiwan many times. I've walked the ground. Every single place that you can land an amphibious ship has obstacles, mine plans ready to go, artillery plans sighted to be able to shoot it. Every piece of ground that you could land a significant number of airborne forces by helicopter or by parachute is mined, defended. Would just be a death trap for the PLA troops that were going in there. So it's a tough job. And amphibious assaults, all of the attention is on that first wave, right? Get on the beach and hold the beachhead. That's not the thing. The thing is what comes afterwards, so you can build it up. And in the case of China, that means you either have to capture a port, Kaohsiung, Taipei, or you have to make an artificial port, and that's really hard to do, and be unlikely that China could sustain the logistic tempo required to do it. So it's hard. And although the PLA generals and the retired PLA officers especially, it always amuses me how much these retired PLA generals say it's easy to do this and China should move, and you want to ask them, well, why didn't you do it when you were on duty, big guy? You know, why are you so brave now rather than when you had to die to do it? And China has not changed that equation that I just described that much. So, and in the case of the international reaction, I think, again, the international economic reaction against Russia was pretty strong. But look at the exports that China has. China doesn't export oil, doesn't export gas. It exports manufactured items that are less expensive, in some cases less capable, than ones you can buy from other companies. If China were subjected to export sanctions, yeah, maybe we might have to pay some more for our children's toys. We might have to pay some more for a tractor that we drove. We probably ought to buy a Kubota anyhow. It's a better tractor, lasts a longer time. So China's products are not as substitutable as the energy products of Russia. So the economic sanctions would bite on China a lot more than they bit on Russia. The military equation is much more difficult than the Russians had, and the Russians didn't do very well. And then finally, from the point of view of a Chinese dictator, Xi Jinping, if he tries and loses, it doesn't mean just he loses the next election. It shakes the very political control that the Communist Party of China has on the entire country. Those are high stakes. Those are high stakes. And if you have an alternative, like, let's see if we can become economically more powerful, let's see if we convince the rest of the world that it's inevitable, that they need to bow to our wishes, let's try that for a while. Let's not roll the dice on this big, dangerous, high-risk military adventure. So nothing that I've read, everything that you've mentioned and more, and I'm not convinced that the chances of China making a move in the near term are very high.
U.S. intelligence community is divided on the assessment of the timeline of possible invasion of Taiwan?
I mean, China doesn't have a timeline. China looks at the situation and says, now the time or not. I mean, probably the timelines that China seems to put out, and I can think of about 4 of them in the time that I've been watching China, serve the same function that the warnings serve on the U.S. side. They try to influence budgets, they try to influence effort, they try to influence activity. But when that timeline comes, any Chinese leader will look at it and say, yeah, it was a good goal, but I think we'll set another timeline. Jiang Zemin had a timeline. So Hu Jintao had a timeline.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, yes.
Thanks very much. I'm Michael Smith from the Australian Financial Review. Could you tell us what alarmed you most from the recent 20th Communist Party Congress in terms of, Xi's speeches or the personnel changes? Was there anything there you would highlight as sort of the most alarming? And secondly, just an Australian question, how significant is Australia's role in this region? We're working a lot more closely with Japan now. What more would you like Australia to be doing in the Pacific in terms of working with the US, etc.? Thank you.
On the 20th Party Congress, I think what was most alarming was that when, at the beginning of that 2-hour talk that Xi Jinping gave, he said, the international situation is dangerous, and he used some nautical, the seas are high and all of that. That's the first time I'd heard that. Remember, his predecessors all would talk about this is a benign international situation and China should take advantage of it to develop ourselves. So that to me was the most alarming, because it opens up possibilities. It gets people thinking in terms of possibilities of military confrontation. When you say the international situation is benign, those of us who had military responsibilities know what our job is. Our job is to just keep it that way. Deterrence, low level, don't get in the news, just make military action by either side unlikely. When you start saying the situation is choppy, you give the bureaucratic system the chance to call for more resources. You can try to turn these deadlines into more. It just makes a more uncertain outline. So that was what worried me the most. The rest of it, I frankly thought it was pretty cool. This guy's going to get old. He's not going to get good ideas. He's got a bunch of sycophants around him. It used to worry me every 10 years when you'd get a fresh batch of 50-something Chinese engineers who were just charging ahead. Now, we're going to have an old Mao, who can barely understand what he's saying, speaks in aphorisms. I think the longer she stays, the better it is for the rest of the world, and the less energy and dynamism and aggression you will see from coming out of China. And these mistakes that he's made in terms of handling his own economic situation, he's taken over every single leading party, and now he owns it, and they're not making very smart decisions. They're killing their good companies, and they're supporting their bad companies, and they're scaring everybody. And they had this big fund to leap China into world leading position on semiconductors, and apparently they've wasted about 50% of that money in Ponzi schemes. So, yeah, I think bring it on. More of what Xi has been doing to his own country is good for the rest of the world. So that's kind of my feeling there. As far as the significance of Australia, I think if we didn't have Australia playing the role it had, we'd like to invent it. It's just a tremendous partner in several respects. Number one, its view of the region is similar enough to the American view, but because Australians live here and have sort of more of a feel of it, talking with my Australian counterparts all the time, I would learn things I didn't know, and it made American policy much better to have a trusted friend who can take you aside and say, Admiral, I know you said that Indonesia is XXX, but let me tell you what's really going on in Indonesia. Or I know that you feel this way about India, but we've had this conversation with India, and so that at the strategic level, the advice of a friend is absolutely critical. At the military level, the balanced forces that Australia have, they're not very good. I mean, they're not very big. They are very good. They're not very big, but they are at everything from the top long-range reconnaissance down to soldiers who know how to fight. And the Australians lean into a fight. I like that, you know. You can't be a wuss in this world, especially in this part of the world. That doesn't mean you go out seeking a fight, but when you decide to do it, you're a force to be reckoned with. And the Aussies are good mates, and they fight hard. So they're great to have operationally along with us. They give us this slightly offset but sympathetic word. And you know what a real ally is somebody who does the right thing when you're not watching them and you're not badgering them. You know, they see the world roughly as you do. They do the right thing. Australia has always been that way. Japan, I'd say for about the last 10 years, has been that way ever since Prime Minister Abe, rest his soul, came in. In fact, I saw in many ways, I saw Japan. The United States was distracted militarily in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were thinking about those places, and Iran, and Japan was chugging along, doing the thinking in this part of the world, even coming up with the phrases like free and open Indo-Pacific. I don't know what that is in Japanese, but translated pretty well into English, and we followed it, and that was a Japanese idea. So Japan is coming that way. So to see Japan, Australia, the United States working together the way we are is just, I think, the best thing for peace in this part of the world and deterrence. So, Mike, more of the same. Tell your readers to keep it up.
I wonder if I could just go to a question from online, which is sort of the inverse of one of the questions we just had. It's from Anthony Rowley of the South China Morning Post. The question is, there seems to be a good deal of fierce anti-China rhetoric emanating from the US administration lately, and some experts in Washington have warned that this could elevate the risk of a military confrontation. What's your view?
You see elevated fear of China or of Russia?
Anti-China rhetoric, it says. Yeah. Military confrontation, it doesn't specify what, but presumably with China.
Right. The mood and the actions now in the United States are very anti-Chinese right at the moment. And you know, when the United States does something, we generally overdo it a little bit, and I think you're seeing some of that right now. Some of it will be peeled back. For example, we started an FBI campaign to investigate postgraduate students and professors and researchers of Chinese heritage, because it had been found that a few of them were in fact spying for China. So we immediately started an FBI program that just went out and looked at lots of them, and it turned out, as you would imagine, most of them were not. They were doing the right thing. In the worst case, they may have filled out some paperwork wrong, but these were not Chinese spies in the United States. So we scaled that program back. In fact, we eliminated the program. We still have a counterintelligence program looking at the role that our universities play, but it's a lot more balanced now. It's a lot more sophisticated. We're not just because somebody's named Chen or Wu, we don't go arrest them and interrogate them. So that kind of thing is fine. Has been scaled back. On the semiconductor front, the United States has taken some very strong actions to ensure that the equipment and the technology and the people for the absolute latest cutting-edge semiconductors that are made in TSMC and a few in Hyundai or in Samsung do not get to China. And I was just on a Zoom call 2 nights ago with Chinese friends, and they're saying, "Oh, you see, the United States is trying to, throttle China, stop it economically," and the answer is no. But we are ensuring that we don't give China the tools to make the greatest chips itself, so that it can use them in the race for artificial intelligence communities, for decryption, quantum and computing, the kind of cutting edge things that are there. So I think there's always a tendency to exaggerate and then to scale back to the reality. So I think what you're seeing now is probably more rhetoric than there is reality, but I don't want to undersell real change in American thinking from trying to help China join the WTO, win-win, anything that's good for China's business is good for American business in the long run. That attitude has very much changed, but I think it's more sophisticated than simple anti-Chinese rhetoric.
Okay, we're very close to the end of our time. Do you have time for another question?
Sure.
Do you need to leave on the dot? Any other questions in the room? Ah, gentleman at the front, thank you.
Takeshi Kawasaki, Independent. What do you evaluate Chinese cyber capability? And what can you tell us about the fight between China and the United States over cyber defense wars?
Okay. Thank you. A few years ago, Chinese cyber capability was large in size and low in skill. They just threw a lot of people at it, and most of their attacks were pretty crude, could be handled. You could see them coming. You may have seen a few indictments of individual PLA cybersecurity units, and some of those indictments had pictures of the actual Chinese hacker on a motorcycle with his girlfriend, which he had put on his own computer. I mean, these were not real pros. I'll put it that way. But as with anything in China, if you have 10,000 people doing it, you're going to find a couple of dozen who really do know what they're doing. And the Chinese are beginning to take these few dozen who know what they're doing and use them in a more targeted manner, even while they are turning loose these relatively crude attacks by not very skilled workers on many targets. Taiwan just lives with this all the time. Political misinformation done in a very crude way by people who don't know much what they're doing. Most of it is the object of jokes in Taiwan, because it's just so obvious. But there are some more serious things in which they're able to put advanced persistent threat malware into infrastructure systems. So I'd say that China is getting better. As far as their ability within the United States, I'd say that on the political influence side, Russia is still more skillful than is China, but China is now attempting it in the United States, and they're having some small success. As you heard from the testimony of Christopher Wray, the FBI director, in sheer numbers of investigations that the FBI is conducting of foreign hacking, China is out ahead by a factor of 5 or 6. So the volume against the United States is huge. So I think that China is getting better. They're becoming more of a factor. The United States is spending more time dealing with them. So it's sort of a ratcheting situation for us.
Okay. Do you have any more time? We're 3 minutes past the hour, but
Sure. I'd
I
say,
did
what
see
do I have
another
next on my...
hand over there,
Let me talk to him.
okay.
Satoru-san, can I take one more question? Do we have
Okay,
time?
right. Okay, David.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Running to the microphone. Thank you. David McNeil for the Irish Times. There was a Pentagon report recently which said that, or predicted that China would have 700 deliverable warheads by 2027. There was also a speech by the Chinese ambassador for disarmament affairs, Li Song, and he wondered if America could do more to scale back this tension, especially nuclear tension, and particularly abandon its first strike policy, or its policy of first strike against China. Do you think there's any merit to those arguments?
No. I used to think the Chinese were really smart with their minimum deterrence, no first use. Didn't waste a lot of money, got a lot of favorable publicity for it, because who the hell knew what they would actually do, but they had this very attractive formula. So if they want to waste money on nuclear forces that gives them no added capability over what they already have, that's just fine with me. As far as the American adoption of a no first use policy, as you know, just last week, the Biden administration published its nuclear posture review, and it went through the rethinking. Do we get anything by not? And we ought to make it clear, we don't have a first use policy. We have a no first use policy, and that's a pretty important distinction. And when we consulted with our allies, including Japan and European countries, they thought that there was an advantage in deterrence to holding on to the no first use policies. And you can imagine circumstances even involving attacks on the United States, particularly with chemical or biological weapons, which we don't have any offensive weapons to be able to respond in kind, that having a nuclear weapon would be a way to deter those attacks. So for all of those reasons, we decided to hold on to our non-first use policy, which is not a first use policy.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for staying on that extra 6
Sure.
minutes.
Thank you for sitting there the whole time.
Right, well, thanks very much.
Okay.
Okay, and I hope you'll come back and see us.
Excellent. Okay.